In this game, the future world champion Robert Fischer squeezes his opponent over the entire board. First he expands on the kingside, then grabs more space in the center, and finally carries out a deadly pawn storm on the queenside, after which the enemy pieces get completely cramped and paralyzed. Fischer starts with e4, his opponent plays the Kagan defense, c6. Fischer opts for his favorite two knights variation, knight c3, d5, knight f3. Black plays the main line, bishop g4, h3, and the exchange on f3 takes place, after which white gets the advantage of two bishops. But black's idea is to place all his central pawns on the light squares, which will restrict white's light squared bishop and turn it into a bad piece. Knight f6, d3, e6. This position already had already arisen in Fischer's previous games, and in those games Fischer played g3 in order to fianchetto the bishop and castle kingside, but black played bishop b4, pinning the knight and threatening d4. Fischer played bishop d2, and after d4 the knight had to retreat, which led to the exchange of the dark squared bishops, after which Fischer lost his advantage of two bishops and remained with his bad light squared bishop. That's why in this game Fischer made an improvement. Instead of g3, he played a3, the prophylactic move preventing black from playing bishop b4. Black played knight d7, and now it seems that the natural move is g3, but Fischer made a stronger move, as the d7 knight prevents the f6 knight from retreating to d7, and the f6 knight doesn't have any other squares to retreat because all those squares are controlled by white. It means if white manages to attack the f6 knight, the only square it can retreat will be g8. And that's why Fischer, instead of g3, plays g4, starting his expansion on the kingside. Bishop d6, g5. The knight must retreat to g8. Fischer continues his expansion. h4. Knight e7, h5. Now it's obvious that black cannot castle kingside. That would be too dangerous because white pawns have already advanced quite far. That's why black plays queen b6, preparing the long castle instead. Now again, the natural looking move is bishop g2, but on g2 the bishop would be restricted by black's pawn chain on the light squares. That's why instead of g2, the bishop moves to h3, attacking e6. And that means the f7 pawn must always keep an eye on e6. And also, by playing bishop h3, of course, Fischer prepares the short castle. Black castles queenside, leaving the f7 pawn unguarded, but of course white cannot capture it. In this case, black would simply play rook f8, the queen must move away, and the catastrophe on f2 would happen. The king must move to d1, after which black would play queen f3, check with the double attack, and the rook on h1 would fall. That's why, of course, Fischer didn't capture on f7, but as the black king has castled queenside, after finishing his expansion on the kingside, Fischer starts the pawn storm on the queenside, a4, threatening a very unpleasant a5. That's why, to prevent this, black plays a5 himself, and Fischer castles kingside. Now his f2 pawn is protected, and white is threatening to capture on f7, and rook f8 wouldn't give anything because after queen takes e6, black wouldn't be able to capture on f2 as it's protected by the rook. That's why black defends his f7 pawn, rook f8. King h1, unpinning the f-pawn, moving away from this diagonal, and that means Fischer is going to move his f2 pawn to f4, grabbing more space on the king side and in the center. And black continues his strategy of restricting the light squared bishop, f5. Now the pawns on e6 and f5 restrict the bishop, and the bishop has turned into a very bad piece on this diagonal. And in case white captures en passant, black would get a very good counterplay on the half-open f-file, attacking the queen, and the f2 pawn would turn into the target. The second rook might move to f8, after which black would exert a very strong pressure on the f-file. That's why, after f5, Fischer of course didn't capture en passant, instead he played queen g2, unblocking his f-pawn. Now he's ready to play f4. Black plays g6, and Fischer advances even further. h6, grabbing more space. As you see, the black's pawn chain on the king side is blockaded, and that means black pieces cannot move to these squares. And also the white pawns control the very important squares in black's territory. G7 and F6 are controlled by the white pawns. That's why black pieces are squeezed, and black has difficulties in maneuvering. King b8 followed. What else? The knight doesn't have any prospects. It cannot move to g8, as from g8 it cannot move to f6 or h6. All these squares are controlled by white. That's why by playing king b8, black vacates the c8 square for his knight. And f4, of course. Now, by playing f4, Fischer gets control over the e5 square and also creates a very unpleasant threat, namely e5, which would grab even more space in the center and on the king side. Namely, the d6 square would be controlled by white. Another square in black's territory would be controlled by white. That's why black had to capture on e4, which black didn't do. In this case, after d takes e, black could have played e5 and black's position would be quite good. Instead of this, instead of capturing on e4, black made a mistake, rook e8, and this lets Fischer advance another pawn. Now the third pawn, besides g5 and h6, the e5 pawn crosses the center and squeezes black even more. The bishop is under attack, so bishop c5 followed, and queen f3. The bishop on h3 isn't doing anything, it's completely restricted. That's why Fischer vacates the g2 square for this bishop. Knight c8, bishop g2, and now that the king side and center is closed, the only active plan white has is the pawn storm on the queen side, and the only way of doing it is, of course, b4. So white will start the preparation of b4, and in the anticipation of this pawn storm, black decided to escape to the king to the king side. That's why black played king c7. The king wants to flee to the king side, and in case black manages to do it, the king would be completely safe, because the king side is completely blockaded and closed. And also by playing king c7, black vacated the b8 square for the knight, and via b8 the knight will move to a6 and control the very important b4 square, preventing white from playing b4. And in order to play b4, white must play c3 first. So the pawn on c3 would support the b4 advance, and also on c3 the pawn would control the central d4 square. That's why Fischer played knight e2, unblocking his c pawn. Knight b8, c3, king d7. So the king is ready to flee. King e7 is coming, and in case black manages to do it, it's not clear how white is going to organize the attack against the black king. So you can now pause the video and try to find Fischer's next move. So white must play energetically. White doesn't have time to prepare the b2. That's why, by playing rook b1, for example. That's why Fischer plays more energetically. Bishop d2 immediately. The bishop now controls the b4 square. As you see, black controls the b4 square so many times, and the knight is coming to a6, controlling it one more time. That's why it's necessary to prepare it energetically. And the bishop on d2 controls the b4 square, supports the advance of the b pawn, and also by playing bishop d2, Fischer connects his rook, and the f1 rook, which isn't doing anything on f1, will come to b1 and support the advance of the pawn. But by playing bishop d2, Fischer actually left his b2 pawn unguarded. But it turns out that black cannot capture it. In this case, black is losing on the spot. After rook b1, the queen must move away, which will lead to checkmate in 1. That's why after bishop d2, black plays knight a6, trying to prevent b4. Fischer plays rook b1, preparing it, and it turns out that black cannot play king e7. Black would love to do it, but it doesn't work because of d4. And it turns out that the king on e7 is cutting the bishop's retreating diagonal, and the bishop would be trapped in this case. So, as black cannot play king e7 at the moment, first black retreats the bishop. And now again, black is ready to retreat. But Fischer plays energetically and starts his deadly pawn storm. b4. So that's the pawn sacrifice, because black controls the b4 square so many times, but still, it's not so, the pawn isn't important here. Fischer is going to open the files on the queen side, and his rooks are ready to this, while black rooks aren't doing anything, and black pieces are completely passive, so it's absolutely fine to sacrifice a pawn here. So a takes b, c takes b. Now the c file is open, and white is ready to play b5, attacking the knight and the c-pawn, which will lead to the opening of the b file. That's why black captures on b4, accepting the sacrifice, pawn sacrifice at least, but of course now the b file is open, the bishop is pinned, and it's attacked 2 times. That means black's position is hopeless, and black queen must always keep an eye on the bishop. The bishop is defended only by the knight and the queen. So Fischer plays, that's why he plays a5, attacking the queen. The queen cannot move far away, it must defend the bishop. That's why queen c5 followed. And now Fischer squeezes black even more, d4, taking under control the c5 square too, and also forcing the black queen to move away to a passive square, queen f8. So that the e7 square is free for the king. Black still hopes to escape to the king side. But of course, black doesn't manage to do it, because after bishop takes b4, knight takes b4, the queen is transferred to the queen side, queen c3, attacking the knight. And there is no way black can defend the knight. The knight can only retreat, after which, of course, rook b7 check followed. And the only move is knight c7. The squeeze is accomplished. Black pieces are completely squeezed in this small box, and the black pieces cannot move. In order to deliver the final blow, Fischer plays knight c1. Via d3 or b3, the knight will jump to c5 with check, and after the king moves, the knight on c7 would fall. That's why black plays rook e7, vacating the e8 square for the king, and the rook from e7 defends the knight. But a6, and there is no way black can stop the advance of the pawn. Black must give up one of the knights for this pawn, so black's position is completely lost, and in this position black lost on time. And now I recommend watching the positional masterpiece of the world champion José Raúl Capablanca, in which he squeezed his opponent over the entire board. But first, like this video and subscribe, as it's really helpful for the channel growth.